you're waiting.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Fox 12 Weather Podcast. This is episode 107. Today is Friday, July 5th. I'm meteorologist Jeff Forgeron, and I am solo on this podcast. In the 107 episodes of the Fox 12 Weather Podcast, I don't think we've ever had a solo podcast, but it is the day after the 4th of July. Mark Nelson is on vacation up in Canada. Katie Suniga is taking a weekend. She'll be working, or she's on her weekend. She's going to be working this weekend. Camilla Ortiz is working all the shows this evening on Fox 12. And so you're left with me. But we have a lot to talk about. We're getting ready for some pretty intense heat across our western valleys, the Gorge, and eventually central and eastern Oregon. And the heat wave actually began yesterday on the 4th of July. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here with a presentation. If you're new to the Fox 12 Weather Podcast, I wanted to make mention that we obviously have an audio version of this. It is a podcast, but the best way to listen or view the podcast is by going onto YouTube, watching this on Fox 12 Now, going on to kptv.com/weather. You'll find the podcast link there or the tab at the top of the screen. We show some really cool graphics on the podcast, some satellite imagery, some satellite loops, a lot of computer model data that helps to break down the forecast and what we're looking at in the days to come and even the long range forecast. So highly recommend that you watch the podcast, but of course we try to do our best to give you, visuals if you're just listening. We try to include everybody that's just listening, maybe in cars or what have you. So anyways, let's get right into the podcast here. Obviously, the big story is the heat that's occurring across the western United States. So we'll touch on why that's happening. We'll go over some 4th of July weather. It was a hot one yesterday, not quite as hot as how hot it's going to be, but I wanted to go over what we typically see on the 4th of July in the metro area, the Portland metro area, that is. We'll go over the forecast, how long this heat is going to stick around. We'll look at the long range forecast, maybe some, slightly cooler weather on the horizon. We do need to do a tropical update. Things have ramped up in the Atlantic Ocean. Hurricane season started June 1st. If you watched last week's episode of the Fox 12 Weather Podcast, I was talking about the tropics and Hurricane Beryl with Camilla. Actually, I don't even think it was a hurricane yet, but it did rapidly intensify as it moved into the Caribbean. So we'll touch on that. And then, of course, we have some viewer photos. So we'll hop into the presentation here. I'm going to start off with some satellite imagery. This is the visible satellite loop this morning, Friday, July 5th, of the western United States, including Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, and a sliver of BC. But you can also see the eastern Pacific Ocean. And what you're probably noticing is a lot of clear air. That's what tends to happen under strong high pressure systems. We have sinking air that essentially eliminates the cloud development. Clouds need rising air to form. And so we're not seeing that. We have a lot of clear sky over the eastern Pacific and the western United States. So that's one view of the satellite imagery. I want to take it to a wider view to give you the entire view of the western United States and a larger portion of the Pacific Ocean. And I'll hop into the presentation here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. I can kind of draw out where the ridge is. The ridge of high pressure is pushing the clouds up to the north, up into the northeast Pacific Ocean and Canada. And then it's kind of sinking, or it's kind of stretching all the way out toward Montana, I guess the interior Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, and the northern high plains. So this ridge is really expanding over the Pacific Northwest and also expanding down over the Southwest and the Great Basin. Look at all the dry air associated with this ridge. So this is water vapor satellite imagery. All the orange and yellow shades on the graphic indicate very dry air. This is super dry air mass that we're seeing that's elevating the fire danger, of course. And, with intensifying heat, we don't really expect very moist air. The blue, the white shades on the graphic indicate more moist air. And that's linked to the clouds that I just talked about that are streaming up into the northeast Pacific Ocean and into Canada. So no surprise here. This is the the watches, warnings, and advisories map. If you were to just go to the homepage of weather.gov, of the National Weather Service homepage, this is what you'll see. And this is something that I open up. One of the first graphics, at least, I open up when I walk into the Weather Center each morning before Good Day Oregon. It's pretty obvious what's happening out west. There are a lot of heat headlines, if you will. So the Maroon shaded areas are excessive heat warnings. Those are the most intense type of warnings for heat. You also have orange shaded areas. Those are heat advisories. I guess that's not maroon. That's more of a violet shade, the excessive heat warnings. Apologies. The maroon shaded areas are farther to the east, and those are excessive heat watches. That tends to mean that there's growing confidence that intense heat is coming. National Weather Service hasn't quite decided if they're going to issue heat advisories or excessive heat warnings, say for eastern Oregon, Idaho, western Montana, and central Nevada. But the heat is underway, and it's only going to be intensifying over the next several days along and west of the Cascades. So we are in it, and that's why excessive heat warnings are currently in place. Some other things that are going on across the United States, there are heat advisories draped across the deep south, the southeast, so essentially from eastern Texas through the deep south all the way to Georgia, across Florida, up and down the East Coast. I believe those are excessive heat warnings in place for parts of North Carolina and Virginia, also in southern Maryland. So there's another large ridge of high pressure that's building over the southeastern quadrant of the United States. And I bring that up because there are also to the south some tropical storm warnings over the Gulf of Mexico. This ridge of high pressure is going to help to steer Hurricane Beryl, Tropical Storm Beryl or Hurricane Beryl, one of the two, depending on its strength. It's going to help to steer it into potentially Texas or northern Mexico. So that system, as I speak, is developing over the Yucatan Peninsula. If you think about where Cancun is, that's where it's moving right now. And it's going to kind of turn up to the northwest thanks to that clockwise rotation of the high pressure. We're going to get into that part of the podcast in a little while, but I just wanted to make mention that there is heat across the southeastern U.S., and there's an approaching tropical system that could be impacting Texas. It looks like early next week. Big story, of course, is the heat out west. So I want to get into what was happening yesterday. We officially hit 92 at PDX, so this was the start of the heat wave. We consider a heat wave here at Fox 12 Oregon 3 consecutive days or more of temperatures at and above 90 degrees. We are totally going to surpass that mark, and we're going to have some pretty extreme temperatures as well. What do we typically see on the 4th of July? The average high temperature in Portland is actually 79 degrees, so we were running 10 to 15 degrees above normal for the 4th of July. We don't tend to see much rainfall around the 4th of July. This is around the driest time of year here in Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington. The last wet 4th of July's happened back in 1998, and 1999. So it's been a while since we've had a soaker on the 4th of July. But we haven't had a whole lot of heat in recent history. I mean, if you include last year, of course, we did have some heat. We hit 96 at PDX. We almost tied a record high. But if you look at the last 8 4th of Julys between 2016 and 2023, only 1 out of 8 of them did we climb into the 90s. The rest of them were in the 70s and 80s. So we've actually had some pretty decent weather around the 4th of July. I guess the saying goes, typically summer doesn't arrive to the Pacific Northwest until after the 4th of July. And maybe that's why back in 2016, we only hit 70 degrees. Most of the day, most of the afternoon was in the 60s with mostly cloudy skies. So yeah, it was a hot one yesterday, but we've talked about how this heat ridge is going to be building over the next several days. This is going to be a slow moving heat ridge. That's why not only will it bring intense heat, but it'll be a long duration heat wave. So check out the upper level pattern. This was the overnight European model run, and this shows you 500 millibar heights. So the red shades, the orange shades, the yellow shades on the map indicate a taller air mass. That's what we typically see with hotter air masses. And then the blue and greens on the map indicate more shallow air masses. That's more linked to low pressure, which we're not going to see much in the way of low pressure anytime soon. So big story is this building heat ridge. This is at the 500 millibar level. You can see it's the center of the ridge as of this afternoon will probably be just offshore of Northern California and Southern Oregon. This is Saturday afternoon's model run, and this starts to bring that heat ridge over Northern California and parts of Southern Oregon. But it kind of is building off to the west of Oregon and Washington. So the ridge axis, the center of the ridge is kind of still offshore of us, up to the north. And then all of a sudden, Sunday And Monday, that heat ridge, center of the heat ridge is kind of building right over the top of the Pacific Northwest with a tilted axis, kind of tilted into California and off to the northwest. So I think our heat is probably going to peak sometime between the weekend, probably Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. You can see the heat ridge starts to work its way to the east between Tuesday, late afternoon, and Wednesday. So the worst of the heat should be past us once we get into midweek or so. But I think it's still going to be very warm, if not hot, Wednesday afternoon. And that's when the heat is really going to start to ramp up in the interior Northwest and the Rockies. We take this into Thursday and Friday. There's still some abnormally warm upper level heights or some abnormally warm air over the Pacific Northwest, as you can see heading into the latter portion of the week. So oftentimes after a big heat wave, we can get just a big rush of cool air, a big marine push. I can think back to June 2021 when we had a huge swing in temperatures between that 116-degree day and the days leading after it. But this one is going to be kind of a gradual cool down. I think we'll end up in the 90s Wednesday, maybe around 90 Thursday, and then hopefully back into the 80s Friday and Saturday. This is the updated 7-day forecast for the Portland metro area that I updated this morning. Again, the day after the 4th of July, if you're watching this a little bit late. And I think that we're going to be right around 100 this afternoon. I think the farther south you're located in our western valleys, the better chance you have at hitting 100. I have a high of 99 today in Portland. It's totally in the realm of possibility we hit 100, but I was just kind of looking at some of the updated model data, and I felt like I needed to dip that down to 99. Still going to be plenty hot, and I think we'll hit or exceed 100 Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Then we get into Wednesday, low to mid 90s. Thursday, I think we could be somewhere between the upper 80s and low 90s, depending on how quickly that ridge wants to move out of here and how much cooler air we start to get from the coast, the cooler sea breeze. Notice those overnight lows. I meant to include some of the records for these dates, but we've been showing them a lot on Fox 12 Oregon. So if you missed them, I'm sure they're going to be shown this weekend. We're going to be in record high territory, and we're going to be in record warm low territory. So we're facing daily record highs starting this afternoon, lasting into early next week, and we could have some record warm nights as well. Notice that the overnight lows are going to be dropping into the upper 60s and low 70s. I think if you quickly glance at that and you're not super familiar with weather and meteorology, you're probably thinking, that's not that hot. That's not that warm for an overnight low. That's around sunrise, folks. That happens at or just after sunrise. The coolest time of the day, I think, is about an hour after our sunrise. So that means that throughout most of the night, the temperatures are going to be falling through the 80s, the 70s. And if you don't have AC cooling down your homes and it's in the 90s and triple digits outside, that house is going to warm up like crazy. And if there's not a lot of cool air to work with outdoors, not much of a breeze, then there's no way to cool down your homes without proper AC. So that's why this is dangerous heat. When we have warm nights like that, it can be really dangerous for vulnerable populations. So there's a Thorns match, by the way, this evening at 7 o'clock. So I think around match time, the Thorns match, we're probably going to be seeing kickoff temperatures somewhere around 96, 97 degrees. I wouldn't be surprised if they delayed the match maybe by an hour, because that sunlight beaming into parts of Providence Park will really warm up those stands. Okay, so longest heat waves on record. This is what we're showing here. This is going to be a long duration heat wave. I think if we end up at or above 90 degrees all the way out through next Thursday, that would be 8 straight days at and above 90 degrees. That would tie for third longest heat wave in the Portland metro area, specifically at PDX. Let's say that we end up with 9 straight days. That would be second. The longest heat wave that we've seen at PDX was 10 days in a row. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. That happened between July 25th and August 3rd back in 2009. Here's something that could happen, though. You saw the 7-day forecast. I'm expecting a high of about 99 today. Let's say that we hit 100 degrees today at PDX, and we're at or above 100 degrees on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. That would be 5 straight days at and above 100 degrees. Folks, we have only done that once in recorded history, dating back to about 1940. So in 1941, in July 1941, we had 5 consecutive days at and above 100 degrees. So I suppose if we do that, this would be a historic heat wave. If we end up with 4 consecutive days at and above 100 degrees, well, that would be tied for second. And we've only had 4 or more consecutive days at and above 100 degrees 3 times in recorded history. One of those was actually last year in August. We had 4 consecutive days at and above 100 degrees. And I believe we hit 108 degrees during that heat wave, if I'm not mistaken. So pretty intense stuff. Let's look at the European ensemble outlook. So this is looking at, basically there are 60 European ensemble members. Think of an orchestra. You have a trumpet player, you have a saxophone player, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you take one computer model and tweak it 60 times, you have an ensemble group. And this shows basically the ensemble outlook for temperatures. All right, hopefully that makes sense for you. I highlighted at the bottom of the screen Friday through either Wednesday or Thursday of next week. Now look at these lines right here on the bottom half of your screen. These are 850 millibar temperatures. This is looking at about 5,000 feet, the temperatures in Celsius. And I've kind of translated on the left side of the screen here. If we see temperatures of 20 degrees Celsius at 5,000 feet during this time of year, that tends to mean that our temperatures rise into the 90s, sometimes well into the 90s. But when we have temperatures of 25 degrees Celsius at 5,000 feet, that could bring us into the upper 90s and triple digits. So the European ensemble and the operational run are not showing quite 25 degrees Celsius temperatures at 5,000 feet through Monday. So that's why I'm keeping temperatures below 105 degrees, and that's why our weather team has on our 7-day forecast. Notice though, Tuesday afternoon, the ensemble members, basically the ensemble mean, is right around 25 degrees Celsius, and the blue line indicates the control or the operational run. That jumps above 25 degrees Celsius. I think Tuesday is a wild card day. I bumped us to 103 this morning. I think Katie had us at 100 or 101 yesterday. So we may need to trend that up if the models continue to show that the atmosphere is going to be that warm. So Tuesday could very well be the warmest day of this heat wave. And oftentimes, the last day of the heat wave can be the warmest day because we have such a warm night prior to that. If we start off around 71 or 72, we're going to get a jump start on the heat. With a warm atmosphere above, lots of sunshine, it's in the realm of possibility we hit 105 on Tuesday. So that's the Euro outlook. Check out the GFS outlook. So this is the GFS ensemble outlook. And it is also showing a very hot atmosphere on Tuesday, potentially around 25 degrees Celsius at 5,000 feet. So Monday, Tuesday, probably going to be the warmest days. You noticed on our 7-day forecast, we have those 2 days at about 103 degrees. So blazing hot conditions. There is some model agreement, though, that between mid to late week, those temperatures are going to be trending down. So that's why we're pretty confident that the heat wave should end around Thursday. The GFS ensemble outlook looks much more promising than the Euro outlook. If you look at the long range here, this drops 850 millibar temperatures down to or below 15 degrees Celsius. That would be much more comfortable. That's like, we're talking 80s, maybe with a good marine push, upper 70s eventually. But the Euro long range outlook is showing a slightly warmer solution. So we could have maybe a few 90s peppered in, low 90s here and there next weekend before things trend down a little bit more. This could end up, I mean, just the way that things are looking for the first half of July, this could be a top 10 warmest July on record here in Portland when all is said and done. So that's kind of interesting stuff. Now, this is just the raw temperature outlook, Euro ensemble outlook. I would ignore the first 6 to 7 days. The long range gives us a ballpark of where we're going to be. And next weekend into the following week, maybe well into the 80s. I think that's definitely possible. I could see a couple of 90s peppered in there, especially next weekend. The GFS ensemble temperature outlook looks a tiny bit cooler in the long range, but plenty warm. Maybe right around where we should be, or a bit warmer than where we should be for mid-July standards. So I had somebody reach out on, and I think it was Facebook. No, actually it was on Threads. And they responded to one of my graphics that I posted about this incoming heat wave in the heat ridge. And they asked, is there any kind of rain in the long range outlook? We are dealing with elevated fire danger now. It's certainly nice to see that we're not going to have an offshore wind that would bring us into critical fire danger modes west of the Cascades with really, really low relative humidity. We're not going to have that offshore wind, but we'll have a northerly breeze almost every afternoon. We'll have hot conditions, creating unstable conditions at the lowest parts of the atmosphere. If a fire were to break out, it could spread rapidly. So fingers crossed that we don't have any fires breaking out during this heat wave. Now, looking at the long range GFS ensemble outlook for precipitation, this is the quantitative precipitation forecast. This takes us through all the way through July and early August. I would take it with a grain of salt way out in time, but this is not looking great in terms of precipitation. It only brings us to maybe a few hundredths of an inch of rain by the first week of August, maybe bone dry for the remainder of July. That would not bode well if fires broke out. That would mean that it would be all up to firefighters to contain and extinguish those fires. So that's the GFS extended ensemble outlook for precipitation. And this is the Euro outlook, which keeps us pretty dry through probably, I would say, July 20th or so, July 19th. Notice, though, there's a bit of an uptick in precipitation, maybe a tenth to a quarter of an inch of rain around the 20th. Don't know what that would be caused by. Hopefully not thunderstorms creating some dry lightning in parts of the Pacific Northwest. There is an interesting blip in the model data around the early part of August, bringing a ton of moisture in, over an inch. I don't know what that is, but that would bode well. I wonder if that has to do with any kind of tropical moisture or monsoonal moisture. But bottom line is we don't have any rain coming anytime soon, especially during this heat wave and probably for the week after the heat wave. So that's your update regarding the heat. It's going to be hot. It's going to be dry. We're going to have some warm nights. So I hope that everybody has a plan in place to how they can keep themselves cool in case you don't have AC in your homes or apartments. Wanted to cover something else that's pretty big that's going on, and that is Hurricane Beryl. Hurricane Beryl became the first Category 4 storm recorded on record in the Atlantic Ocean. That happened, the first Category 4 hurricane in the month of June. Happened at the end of June. It was moving toward the Caribbean and eventually crossed into the Caribbean. This was a snapshot of Hurricane Beryl as a Category 5. Look at that defined eye there. And Hurricane Beryl became the earliest Category 5 hurricane in recorded history in the Atlantic Ocean. So it swept through the Windward Islands, and now then it made its way across the Caribbean. This was a fantastic visible satellite image with some lightning going on around the eye wall of Hurricane Beryl. I believe Hurricane Beryl had peak wind speeds around 165 to 170 miles per hour. Major Category 5 hurricane at its peak. This is a visible satellite loop this morning of Hurricane Beryl, and what you can see is it's crossing over the Yucatan Peninsula. I mentioned Cancun. There were probably some impacts there and some impacts around Tulum. There have been hurricane warnings in place on the east coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, and this system is kind of losing its, I guess you could say it's not as well defined. That tends to happen when tropical systems move over land. Tropical systems like the warm water of the Pacific. They don't like interacting with land. They certainly don't like interacting with mountains. And they do not like upper-level winds because those upper-level winds can shear those hurricanes up and essentially lead to more disorganized tropical systems. So the system is weakening. That is some good news. The last check, again, I got this information in around 9 a.m. this morning. This was actually officially the 10 a.m. Central Time advisory of Hurricane Beryl from the National Hurricane Center. Hurricane Beryl was packing sustained winds of, I believe, 85 miles per hour. There you go. Moving northwest at about 16 miles per hour. This is the forecast cone. This is the projected path of Hurricane Beryl. It's expected to weaken to a tropical storm as it moves into the Gulf of Mexico because of the interaction with the Yucatan Peninsula. But then the Hurricane Center is expecting it to reform strengthen into a Category 1 hurricane before making landfall either along the northern coast of Mexico, in northeast Mexico, or the southern coast of Texas. And there are probably some impacts coming to Texas. Give me a second here. I'm just going to sip some water. It's a little difficult not having somebody to interact with on the podcast, but we're making it work. All right. So I'm going to read some of the key messages coming in from the National Hurricane Center. Dangerous winds, storm surge, and heavy rainfall will continue over portions of the Yucatan Peninsula within the warning areas today. Residents there should shelter in place until life-threatening conditions subside. Next up, it's going to be moving over the Gulf of Mexico, as I mentioned. There is an increasing risk of hurricane-force winds, life-threatening storm surge, and flooding from heavy rainfall in portions of northeastern Mexico and the lower and middle Texas coast late Sunday into Monday, so late this weekend into early next week. Interests in these areas should closely monitor updates to the forecast. Storm surge, hurricane, tropical storm watches will likely be issued later today for that region. So northern Mexico to the Texas coastline, where the two countries meet there. Rip currents will cause life-threatening beach conditions beginning late today and continuing through the weekend across much of the Gulf Coast. Beach goers should heed warnings, et cetera, et cetera. So this system is likely to cause problems along the U.S. Gulf Coast, but specifically along the western Gulf Coast closer to Texas. So flooding is possible out there. If you have family or friends in southeast Texas, make sure that they're keeping an eye on the tropics. I'm sure they are. It is that time of year. Let's get into some of our viewer photos because we had a couple of really cool ones come in. Shout out to Gary Peterson. He tends to make some appearances here on the podcast and on Good Day Oregon. He sends some really cool shots in. Gary shot this the evening of the 4th of July, and this was of Tillamook Rock Light. This was out at Ecola Beach near Cannon Beach, and just a beautiful shot of the lighthouse there, and of course the sun setting. So thanks to Gary for sending that in. And we're going to wrap up this podcast with a shot from Timberline Lodge. Thanks to Jane Lundberg for sending this in on the 4th of July. The lodge was behind her, I believe, and so was Mount Hood. She's looking off to the south toward Mount Jefferson, or as many here in the Pacific Northwest like to call it, Mount Jeffy. So a great shot there, clear skies. This was our first day of the heat wave in the lowlands west of the Cascades. And temperatures are even going to warm up in the mountains. There are some heat advisories in place for areas like Government Camp where temperatures will rise probably into the 80s. Always appreciate your viewer photos, by the way. If you want to get featured on the podcast, if you snap something cool around the Pacific Northwest, the best way to do it is downloading the Fox 12 weather app and submitting your photo there, or go to kptv.com/weather. At the top of the screen, you'll see a Submit Photos tab. Every morning when I'm in the studio, I'm looking at what viewer photos are sent in. I love to include them on the podcast and, of course, on Good Day Oregon. And I know our evening meteorologists like to include them as well on our evening newscast. So, boy, that wraps it up for the first ever solo podcast on the Fox 12 Weather Podcast. Man, if you're going to be outside at all over the next week or so, which I imagine some of you will be, stay cool out there, apply sunscreen, take frequent breaks. I know there's more intense heat going on in parts of the United States, but we've only reached the low 90s so far this year in the Pacific, or in the Portland metro area for that matter. So our bodies are not necessarily acclimated to the triple-digit heat. So again, take frequent breaks and stay cool out there. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Fox 12 Weather Podcast. We'll see you soon.
You're waiting and hesitating and tell us